Hi, I'm Nora Duncan, State Director for AARP Connecticut, and welcome to another episode of Coffee and Tea with AARP Connecticut, an interview series on the issues important to people 50 plus in Connecticut and their families. Today we are speaking with Keith Phaneuf. Keith has been a journalist for decades, but he's been the state finance reporter for the Connecticut Mirror since 2010. Keith knows more about the state budget than most of the people who vote on it and is well respected at the Capitol and beyond. Keith, welcome to the program. And I'd love for you to tell us a little bit about yourself and the Connecticut Mirror.
Oh, it's great to be here, Nora. I have been committing journalism in Connecticut for the last 37 years. And like you said, I've been covering state finances for a long time, since 1993, and with the Mirror since it launched in 2010. For the folks who aren't familiar with ctmirror.org, we're a free nonprofit news site focused specifically on state policy. We were launched to fill a gap in coverage as more and more traditional news organizations, newspapers, television, radio stations cut back their coverage of the Capitol, fiscal policy, state politics. The Mirror's tried to step in and give people a place where they can go and keep up with these issues. And fortunately, because of the support of a lot of grassroots followers, we've been able to stay afloat now for 16 years. I should have also mentioned to you, by the way, I am an AARP member. So I hope that counts for something in this interview.
We love our members, Keith. It counts for everything. So let's get into it. I know I turn to you when I need to understand the budget. So I can tell you there's been times I've wanted to just send you a text and say, explain this to me. But I try to not bother you too much. But the biggest conversation happening around the budget in the last year has been around the fiscal guardrails. Can you explain the guardrails and why there's so much division within the state capitol and within advocacy groups about whether or not they should be adjusted?
Sure. So I assume you've got 8 or 9 hours and I'll just take us through it, no problem. Or I'll give you the Reader's Digest version. The best way to describe the fiscal guardrails is there are a series of budget controls, things like there's a spending cap that tries to keep the growth in the budget in line with household income. There's a borrowing cap that says how much money should we be bonding to build roads, construct schools, maintain state buildings. But we've also added some savings programs that are arguably, based on the numbers, very aggressive. Probably the most controversial is called the volatility adjustment, but don't get lost in the language. Volatile state revenue simply means revenue that fluctuates a lot year to year. One year could bring in big dollars, another year small dollars. Starting in 2017, we decided that a portion, not all, but a portion of our income tax receipts that are tied to capital gains, dividends, basically think investments on Wall Street, and a portion of our business tax receipts, primarily LLCs, other type of partnerships, a category that includes hedge funds, which again brings you back to Wall Street. We decided some of that money shouldn't be spent. But the key is how much? And that's what the big debate is on right now. We took a stab at sort of setting a threshold back in 2017. We said, how much should we spend over $3.1 billion? And the answer was nothing. Anything that comes in from these sources over $3.1 billion, we shouldn't spend. And then each year we adjust that threshold for inflation. But if your original threshold is no good, you're saving a lot of money. If your original threshold is not high enough, maybe you're not saving anything. But the reality has been Connecticut has produced massive surpluses ever since then. And there's a growing movement in the legislature to say, quite frankly, we've gone too far. No one, not a single person, the most liberal to the most conservative, has suggested repealing this system. In the same way, if you woke up in the morning in midwinter and you were really hot, you wouldn't go downstairs and rip your furnace out and throw it on the lawn. You'd simply adjust the thermostat. Folks are saying we have been saving huge amounts of volatile money year after year. About 7% of the budget has been taken away, which is very important because so much of the budget is fixed. And it's almost become an oxymoron. You can't have very reliable volatile money. You can't be both stable and unstable at the same time, which says we've probably got it calibrated poorly. And that is sort of the big fight now, which is simply, can we save a little less and still balance our budgets, chip away at our pension debt, which I should have mentioned is very large. And there's, of course, the last point I'll make, the fear that once we start adjusting or reforming this system, will the General Assembly, which in past decades has been careless about savings, go back to bad habits? So some folks are afraid to say the minute we start with this exercise, it'll end in a bad place.
So my feeling and listening to the governor speak quite a bit is that that's exactly what he's afraid of, is that if you open the door, it's really opening the floodgates. And he's very concentrated on spending down that pension debt, while others are interested in more of like social services, education. And I think time will tell where we land on that. But yes, thank you for that explanation. Even the Reader's Digest version is complicated.
It is.
I think we need cliff notes for the next one, maybe. That's what I need to carry in my bag with me when I go to the Capitol from now on.
This was about as bad as it gets. I promise it'll get less wonky from here.
It wasn't even bad. It's just a complicated situation. If it was easy, we would have solved it by now, right? All right, so let's talk about the big funding priorities that are being talked about now. It's, press conference time, leadership announcing their priorities, advocacy groups coming out. What are the big funding priorities?
I would say probably the one coming into this session that has the most support. It's got bipartisan backing. It has the support of the governor. You're seeing social service advocates back for it. You're hearing the business community back it, and that's childcare. That industry really has still not fully recovered economically from the first year of the pandemic. Businesses want affordable childcare so more people can fill certain types of jobs where they've got shortages. I would be very surprised to see us adjourn in early June without any additional money for that industry. You will see a big push to increase funding for higher education, even with some of the dings higher ed has taken in their reputation. There's been some accusations of some careless spending in the state university system. But the indisputable fact is it costs 11% more this fall just to go to community college than it did 2 years ago. You can go to a regional state university and live on campus, and it's going to cost you $30,000 a year. It's up 8% over the last 2 years. I think you're going to see some push on that. There are folks who are still saying we're not doing enough to help towns with K-12 education. There's a big gap in what the towns face in special education costs and how much the state is covering. The Republican minority wants to have a big debate on winter heating assistance. We know that the federal government has not been keeping pace with the demand for winter heating assistance. And basically what Connecticut provides here is just we take federal funding and dole it out. We don't really put state dollars on top of it. We're seeing demand that is probably 30 or 40% higher than it was before the pandemic, and we're getting the same funding we were getting before the pandemic, which means some households are losing up to $1,000 in one winter season compared to what they were getting a few years ago. And then just lastly, I'll say I expect a very heated debate on Medicaid. We have not adjusted the rates in a comprehensive fashion that we pay doctors who treat the poor since 2008. We're wrapping a 2-year study on that. For example, everyone assumes because Connecticut and its wealth that we pay so well. We actually rank 42nd in the nation in what we pay doctors who are specialists who treat poor patients. So if you're on Husky and you have to see an oncologist, you have cancer, you're going to a doctor willing to treat you. We're not competing with New York and Maryland and other wealthy states. We're actually just ahead of West Virginia. I'm trying to stay ahead of Mississippi and Arkansas. Those, I think, will be the big things. You will see some talk about trying to help the nonprofit social services who deal with folks with disabilities. I think you'll try to see them take a look at the hospital tax because of the bankruptcy issue with Prospect Medical Holdings. I'm not sure you're going to see any movement, though, this year.
Yeah, all those things you talked about, and I think about the federal government's interaction and the what we don't know, that possibly Medicaid cuts coming down, possibly cuts to the heating assistance and program. So yeah, and that could impact all the other budget priorities, right? So if we receive less from the federal government, we're talking about the fiscal guardrails, what happens to other priorities like education, childcare. So there's a long way to go before this session's over. And then maybe we don't even know the answers to some of the federal questions until we're well on our way.
I think that the new Trump administration, the Republican Congress is really the biggest wild card, like you said. I think, some folks forget. I mean, we get billions of dollars a year in Medicaid, but we also get about $1 billion in transportation construction grants. We don't know if the new Congress is going to be as aggressive as the old ones in terms of trying to help states fund transportation. We have smaller things like Title I, II, and III funding that'll make a big difference for local school districts if that slides. And the other thing, and I know you already mentioned this, Nora, we don't know if we're going to get a clear picture by the time the state legislative session ends in early June, or if they're going to be scrambling back in a session this fall to deal with problems.
Yeah. Nothing makes me sadder than summer special session. So
Yeah.
Let's hope not.
Right there with you.
Okay, so kind of we just foreshadowed my next question. What do you think the governor's 2-year budget is going to look like? Are there any surprises coming our way? Do you think there's going to be cuts?
I will go out on a limb and say you are not going to get any big surprises. Now, what your definition of big is and mine might be different, but the reason I feel confident saying that is because there's no room for surprises. These budget controls that supporters call fiscal guardrails don't really allow for them. Again, we have a spending cap. It's designed to keep most segments of the state budget growing at the same pace as personal income. We do allow adjustments for inflation if that's greater, but most years it only allows most segments of the budget to grow by about 2 to 3%. In the context of our current $23 billion general fund, we're looking at maybe growth in the new year of about $900 million. And don't get lost in the numbers. Here's what's important to remember from that. More than half of it, about $500 million, is already eaten up. It's going for fixed costs such as Medicaid, which is an entitlement program, payments on bonded debt, and then required contributions to retiree health care and to state employee pensions. And I will just very quickly go aside. Someone will say, no, Keith, you've got that wrong. Because of all the money our guardrails have saved and all the surplus dollars we've poured into our pensions, aren't our pension contributions going down like the governor says? They're not going down. Last year, they went up about $80 million. The governor points out that they would be going up even higher if we hadn't put all this surplus in. But programs aren't benefiting from that savings. The state is basically keeping it. If we didn't put all that money in the pensions, they wouldn't have gone up 80 million. They would have gone up about $700 million. So core programs were spared a cut, but they've still basically been on just this side of a starvation diet for probably the last 4 or 5 years. We'd have noticed it more if we hadn't gotten all the emergency pandemic aid we've gotten, because we can spend that outside of the guardrails, outside of the limits like the spending cap. Getting back to this new budget, the other reason there's no room for surprises is every single major state employee union's contract is up. And ever since we've been running up huge surpluses, we've been finding that when we go into negotiation with the state employees, they're basically able to get almost 5% raises. They've been getting about 4.5% raises a year. And when you run up big surpluses, it's hard to make a case to arbitrators that you can't afford those raises. And since nobody has proposed reforming the arbitration system, you're probably going to look at least 200 million more going for state employee raises. Between the fixed costs and the raises, there's not that much left to do anything with. And like I said, I think childcare is at the head of the line. I will also mention, though, there's one exception to that, and that's a little portion, about 10% of the state budget we know is the Special Transportation Fund. We've been actually running really big reserves there, even though you say just a few years ago, the governor wanted tolls and he didn't get them. The problem is the Department of Transportation is not able to ramp up enough construction projects. They always seem to aim for more than they can get done. And the main thing the transportation fund pays for is the principal and interest on all the borrowing we do. That's how we fund. If you fix a road or bridge, you may borrow money for 10 or 15 or 20 years. Then you pay off the principal and interest in the Special Transportation Fund. I think you're going to see a stronger push from the legislature. And I think the governor's going to do something about it to basically say, look, you've got to start using it or lose it. If you can't use all this money, let's lower gas taxes, let's do something else. And I think the governor is going to keep proposing, because he doesn't want to give the money back. But we may not be able to build enough roads fast enough. So he's going to say, let's take what's left over in the transportation fund and at least pay down some older bridges that we've already finished, but we're still paying on. Some older road highway work that we've finished, but we're still paying on. At least save the taxpayers principal and interest. It might not be as exciting, but whenever people see that there's money left in the transportation fund, they want to know, what are you doing with it?
All right. So you mentioned, the gas tax. And so I was going to ask you next about tax cuts and tax credits. I'm hearing from both sides, both things. And maybe, I don't know, what are you hearing? Because you hear a lot more than me.
I am not expecting much. That said, I think the governor has to do something small. I don't agree with some of the speculation that you'll see something involving the income tax and the income tax rates. I don't think the state can afford that. You might say, how, when you're saying these guardrails are producing huge surpluses? These surpluses that we're saving, it's almost, think of it as money that we're grabbing out of the budget right when the year begins and putting it off to the side in another shoebox. Then when you look at what's left after the mandatory savings, that's what a tax cut would come out of. And we really can't spare that. This aggressive savings program actually interferes with your ability to cut taxes, because all this special money you're saving, you can't return that to the taxpayer. Just as the savings program says you can't spend it on childcare or municipal aid or something else legislators want, you also can't give it back to the taxpayers in the form of relief. So in terms of what's actually available to give back, there's not that much. That said, after Donald Trump won the race for president, Governor Lamont came out and said he thought the National Democratic Party had lost sight of the plight of the middle class. So it's kind of hard for him to say that and not do anything. What could he do with not a lot of money, but that might still stick out to people? You could see him doing some changes with the sales tax, maybe exempting a few areas. There's always been a push to exempt more in the area of clothing. You might see them tighten up the cap on property taxes on motor vehicles. There's a limit on how much cities and towns can tax motor vehicles. They may tighten that limit. So in some communities, your car tax might go down. I honestly think that's about as far as the governor can go, unless he's willing to reform these savings rules. And I should also have pointed out, Nora, some of the Republican in the minority who actually back Governor Lamont for the most part on these fiscal controls would like to see reforms so they could give some of the saved money back to households in the form of tax relief.
Yeah, that's interesting. So I know there's been some, when you talk about middle class, like the extra sales tax that was added on meals, for instance, in restaurants, right? Pulling that back to the regular tax 6.35 or whatever we are for
Correct.
regular sales tax, right?
That is definitely in some people's sights.
Yeah. So some things that just even things out. And you mentioned, I'm thinking back to the year of the cap on how much you can tax a car and how that was the same time when they the value of a used car skyrocketed during the pandemic, or like right after the pandemic, and how people were told they were getting a property tax cut on their motor vehicles, and then they saw it go up, and how that landed not so well with a lot of people. Even though it had to do with the value of the vehicle, but it's an interesting and complicated area where I feel
Yes.
like people want to say they can do something, and sometimes even when they do, folks don't really feel it. And that's the juxtaposition of sitting at home managing your budget and sitting at the Capitol and making decisions.
And right now, that is the thing. I mean, these guardrails, these savings programs, in part are so controversial because they affect so many areas. Just as it's hard for liberals in the legislature to say, well, how come I can't do more for childcare or social services when I see these big surpluses? There are conservatives who get frustrated when they say, why can't we return some of this to taxpayers? We have to save it. Right now, all this money we're saving, I just should point out again, we're basically pouring it all into pension funds for state employees and for municipal teachers that we failed to properly save for the better part of 70 years. And we ran up tens of billions of dollars of what I would call pension debt, unfunded obligations. Even with all the money we're pouring into it, it's not like the problem will be solved in the next year or two. We'll be paying on the unfunded liability until the late 2040s. So some folks are saying, maybe we should adjust the pace, because even going crazy on this, we're not saying, oh, can we just go crazy for 1 or 2 years and then we'll go back to normal. Right now, even saving at this breakneck pace, we're asking every other program, can you hold on for a few more decades and then we'll get back to normal? I don't think it's going to be sustainable politically.
It's hard to make up for 70 years of not paying your bills, turns out.
It's like not brushing your teeth for 70 years, going to the dentist and demanding a fun root canal. It simply
It's just
doesn't
saying,
exist.
I just want to take my samples home and have a clean bill of health after 70 years of nothing isn't going to work. Yeah.
No.
All right. So we have that. All right. Let's go with my last question. Fast forward a couple months from now, and do you see us getting to a budget that the governor is willing to sign by the end of the regular 2025 legislative session in early June?
And this is without a doubt the most important question to me, because it could be rephrased as, will Keith get to take his summer vacation on time this year?
I hope it's refundable, Keith. That's all I'm saying.
We've already decided not to put our money down. That will tell you where we're going with this. Of course, it's always a better bet that they're going to finish on time. That has really been the case for quite a while. However, if we are not able to channel enough money to appease the Democratic majorities in the House and Senate into core programs, the only leverage they have with Governor Lamont is to not give him a budget. That's basically it. You can sit on it and sit on it. We've seen that type of approach in the past. We saw it in 2017. We saw it in 2009. We saw it in 1991 in the battle that produced the state income tax. And the longer the fight goes, the more it chops into the governor's approval rating. Generally, it's the governor who takes it on the chin when the legislature can't give a budget, when programs don't start on time, when aid to municipalities gets held up. So if you see this budget not wrapped up by the first week of June and it goes into the new fiscal year in July and August, and by the way, we don't know if Governor Lamont is running again or not, he may be more inclined to settle and compromise in certain areas if the legislature waits him out. I realize I kind of ducked your question. I still think it's more likely they get it done on time, but there's a greater threat this year of a delayed budget battle than there has been arguably since 2017, which was the last time we went almost to Halloween at that point.
I recall.
Yes.
Yeah, the fact that you haven't booked your vacation, that is telling me quite a bit, but maybe a nice late fall, early winter vacation someplace warm, Keith. Maybe that'll be the way to
That
go.
may have to be the compromise, because the staycation is not going to do it.
Okay. Keith, with that, that's all the time we have for today. I really appreciate you being here with us and taking the time and sharing your expertise. Everyone can read Keith in the Connecticut Mirror on a regular basis. Thanks to all of you for tuning in to another episode of Coffee and Tea with AARP Connecticut. Join us again next time and catch back episodes on demand right here on our Facebook page or on YouTube. And you can go ahead and scan the QR code to become an e-advocate and help us advance policies important to the 50 plus in Connecticut this legislative session and beyond. Thanks, Keith. Take care, everyone.